Discover God's Plan by David J. Hensley. Week 1, Day 2. Authorship, Argument and Counter-Argument. How do we know the Gospel of John was written by John? As Christians, one of the central pillars of our faith is the reliability of the Scriptures. The New Testament Gospels provide us with the foundation of our knowledge about Jesus Christ, His life, His teachings, His miracles, His death, and His resurrection. Among these Gospels, the Gospel of John holds a unique place because of its profound theological depth and distinct style. But how do we know that this Gospel was written by John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 apostles? And why is it important to understand the authorship of this particular Gospel? Internal evidence. Clues from within the Gospel. One of the strongest pieces of evidence pointing to John as the author comes from within the text itself. Although the Gospel does not explicitly name its author, it provides subtle clues. The most prominent of these is the reference to the disciple whom Jesus loved. This figure is not explicitly named, but appears at key moments in the Gospel. See John 13:23, 19:26 through 27, 20 verse 2, 21 verse 7, and 20 through 24. In the final chapter of the Gospel, we find an explicit statement concerning authorship. This is the disciple which testifieth of these things and wrote these things, and we know that this testimony is true. John 21:24, King James Version. The author identifies himself as the beloved disciple. The early church overwhelmingly identified this beloved disciple as John, the son of Zebedee. The intimate relationship between Jesus and this disciple, the first-hand witness of key events, such as the crucifixion, and the personal details included in the Gospel, example, the private conversation between Jesus and Peter after his resurrection in John 21, all point to someone who had a close personal relationship with Jesus. This fits the profile of John, who was not only one of the 12, but also part of Jesus' inner circle along with Peter and James. The unique nature of the Gospel. John's Gospel stands apart from the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in both style and content. It includes unique events, such as the raising of Lazarus in John 11, and focuses more heavily on the theological significance of Jesus' words and actions. The prologue, see John 1 through 18, with its declaration of Jesus as the Word, meaning Logos made flesh, sets the tone for the entire Gospel, emphasizing the divine nature of Christ. This theological depth is consistent with what we know about John from the rest of the New Testament. John, the author of the 3 epistles in the book of Revelation, often dwells on themes of light, life, love, and the identity of Jesus as the Son of God, core themes that also dominate the Gospel of John. The continuity of thought between these writings strengthens the case for John's authorship. John's eye for detail, a first-hand witness. The Gospel of John contains many details that indicate it was written by someone who was either a direct eyewitness or had intimate access to eyewitness testimony. John mentions specific places such as the pool of Bethesda in John 5:2 and the pool of Siloam in John 9:7, and includes detailed interactions between Jesus and individuals like Nicodemus in John 3, the Samaritan woman in John 4, and Mary Magdalene in John 20. John's Gospel also describes personal experiences that seem to come from someone who was present, such as his account of the crucifixion. John is the only Gospel writer who records that blood and water flowed from Jesus' side when he was pierced. See John 19:34. This kind of detail suggests a first-hand witness, which supports the idea that John, as one of Jesus' closest disciples, was indeed the author. Early church testimony. Affirmation from the early Christians. Another significant line of evidence comes from the testimony of early Christians. The early church fathers overwhelmingly attributed the 4th Gospel to John. Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, directly names John the Apostle as the author of the Gospel. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who, according to tradition, was a disciple of John himself. This strong line of apostolic tradition gives us great confidence that the Gospel was authored by John. Clement of Alexandria, another early church father, also confirmed that John wrote his Gospel. He described John's Gospel as a spiritual gospel, suggesting that it was written after the synoptics to complement them with a deeper, more theological reflection on Jesus' life and ministry. In fact, no other author was seriously proposed in the first few centuries of the church. The consistency and unanimity of the early church's witness provide a compelling reason to accept John as the author. Counterarguments. What are the challenges to John's authorship? Despite the substantial body of evidence, some modern scholars have questioned whether John the Apostle wrote the gospel attributed to him. Let's explore a few of the primary counterarguments. The gospel's Greek style and advanced theology. One argument against Johannine authorship is the sophisticated Greek and high Christology, which is the study of the nature of Christ, found in the gospel. Some scholars argue that a fisherman from Galilee, like John, would not have been capable of producing such a work. However, this argument underestimates the educational context of the time. Greek was widely spoken throughout the Roman Empire, even in Galilee, and John likely would have been familiar with it. Furthermore, John had decades to reflect on his experiences with Jesus before writing his gospel. By the time of the writing, likely around AD 90, he would have had a deep understanding of Jesus' identity and mission. It's also possible that John worked with a scribe or disciple who helped to record his thoughts more formally, much like Paul did with some of his letters, example Romans 16:22. This would account for the polished nature of the Gospel's Greek. The alleged anonymity of the Gospel. Another argument is that the Gospel does not explicitly name John as its author. This leads some scholars to suggest that the beloved disciple could be someone else, such as Lazarus, or a figure representing a group of early Christians. However, the identification of the beloved disciple with John has been the overwhelming consensus throughout church history, as we have seen. Furthermore, the anonymity of the author might actually support Johannine authorship. John's humility and desire to focus attention on Christ rather than himself could explain why he chose not to name himself directly. Differences from the Synoptic Gospels. Critics also point out that the Gospel of John differs significantly from the Synoptics in terms of chronology, content, and style. For example, John places the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, whereas the Synoptics place it at the end. However, these differences can be explained by John's unique purpose and theological focus. While the Synoptics provide a more chronological account of Jesus' life, John's Gospel is more concerned with conveying the meaning of his actions and words. These variations do not necessarily indicate a different author, but rather a different approach to recounting the same story. Trusting the Gospel's authorship. As Christians, we believe that the Bible is inspired by God, and that includes the authorship of its books. The Gospel of John, with its deep spiritual insights and vivid portrayal of Jesus as the Son of God, has been recognized from the earliest days of the Church as the work of John, the beloved disciple. While modern scholars may raise questions, the internal evidence of the Gospel itself, the consistent testimony of early Church Fathers, and the vividness of the eyewitness accounts all point to John as the author. Though counter-arguments exist, none of them provide sufficient reason to overturn the traditional view. We can trust that the Gospel of John was written by someone who walked with Jesus, witnessed his glory, and wanted us to share in the eternal life that only he can give.